distinguished professors, Dr. Amastanen, ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure. I think this is an innovation which we're doing this year compared to last year where we just had some paper presentation. So this year we thought we were going to have a more interactive session where basically we would have policymakers, academics, and also policy deciders amongst us. We've tried to innovate by having a round table, basically, and Dr. Stanen has kindly agreed to be the moderator. So, since we're very pressed for time as well, I'll leave the floor to Dr. Stanen so that then he'll explain how we're going to proceed with it. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. We've got 90 minutes to spend together. Now, I'm neither a policymaker nor a distinguished professor, as my four panelists. And the way I intend to proceed is to assign 6 minutes to each of the panelists on the first part of the agenda. I will tell you what it is. And 6 minutes to each panelist on the second section of the agenda. And then I'm going to ask them a few questions. And then we're going to throw open the debate to the audience. The title is Impact of Financial Crisis on Trade and Investment, focusing on developing countries or emerging economies. Now, we have decided that we're going to focus on the impact and on the policy response. I think most of you who are in the audience, I think all of us have a very good idea of what have been the underlying causes that have brought us where we are. And it makes most sense probably to spend our time on deliberating on the consequences of a financial crisis, which has now become an economic crisis, and what have been the policy responses, and what lessons we can draw from these policy responses going forward. And what I'm suggesting, that we are going to focus the first part of the discussion on impact analysis. And we all know what has been the impact. Initially, even in Mauritius, let alone in many countries in Africa, many of us believed that it was going to be short-lived and it was going to be shallow, and that we were not going to be affected, that we had built resilience. But I think now it's increasingly evident that it's going to last longer, and it's also going to be deeper. And I've tried to identify 5 or 4 impacts. The first one is the impact on goods, on trade in goods and services. That's the first one, the first transmission mechanism. Now, of course, some countries have been affected by the first round itself, depending on how integrated these economies are in the global economy and also the structure of the economy. South Africa, because they have been affected by the price of commodities, they have been affected by what has happened in the financial market, and they have been affected also by what has happened in the exchange rate market. But most economies probably have been affected by the secondary impact through what we call the transmission mechanism of trade in goods and trade in services. So the first impact we're going to consider will be the impact on trade in goods and services, and Minister Said Hussein has kindly agreed to discuss this issue. The second one is the impact on key economic indicators. Professor Kramer has agreed to discuss on that, and what we understand by this, the impact of the financial and economic crisis on growth, on employment, on the deficit, the budget deficit, on debt, on the external balance, and also on reserves. There are also some implications, which probably we won't have time to go into, on poverty alleviation, on how countries in Africa are going to reach the MDGs, on the rising trend of youth unemployment for the last 3 or 4 years, on how women probably are more affected by the crisis than men, and also on rising inequality. I don't know whether we'll have time to discuss all these issues. And then there will be the impact on capital flows. And Professor Mauricio has agreed.
I will do capital flows.
You will do the capital flows, you will do, okay, all right. And in terms of capital flows, and we know what they are, it's the impact on foreign direct investment, the impact on portfolio investment, and there are many countries also that depend on remittances, workers' remittances, and there are yet some other countries that depend on aid flows, ODA. So we're going to examine basically what has been the impact of capital flows on these countries. And last and not least, Professor Granberg has agreed to put some question and raise some issues on the economic model of Mauritius in the light of the financial and economic crisis. So this is the first part of the discussion. And after we've concluded this first part of the discussion, I will introduce the second part of the discussion, which is essentially around what have been the policy responses that have been adopted by policymakers in order to mitigate the adverse impact of the financial and economic crisis. So I'll ask Minister Saidosen to take us through on the impact of the financial and economic crisis on trade flows, both for goods and services. Mr. Saidosen.
Thank you, Dr. Sidanen. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Before talking about trade flows in goods and services, I would like to make one statement, which is eminently a political statement, that is economic development linked to trade flows, to investment, to production, to growth, have to impact on human development. What matters, after all, beyond plus or minus figures in statistics, is how this impacts on the well-being of the people. And therefore, from that point of view, one dimension which we have to take into consideration is the impact of trade, investment, production, growth on employment. And this is one consideration which is very important for us. Well, some very basic figures now for the moment, at least at the end, by end September 2012, what we see is that in general for our export sector, in 2012 we have suffered more than we did last year in 2011. If we take all the different subsectors which make up the export, what we call the export-oriented enterprises, in 2011 we managed to have a growth of plus 8.4%, something like that. And September 2012, and the figures will probably remain the same for October 2012, we have a slight growth of plus 1.2%, which is obviously a less good performance than what we had last year. The manufacturing sector, which is made up of three subsectors, first of all, we have their 1.2% increase, growth. We have suffered substantially, I would say, in our textiles subsector. What has happened here is that whilst in general the industry has grown more or less up market, we have moved up the value chain. On the other hand, we have lost to delocalization a substantial amount of production. Certain big local companies, and of course we can't blame them, they are in business, have delocalized certain types of production to Madagascar, to Sri Lanka, to India, and to Bangladesh, with the result that in textiles, in general, in figures, in terms of value, we have a negative growth of 8% in September 2012 as compared to 2011. The seafood hub, which has to do with processing of fish that in general we do not catch. I mean, it isn't our ships that catch the food, the fish. We buy them from ships which catch them further north in the Indian Ocean. We have a growth of about 8%. But then this is, again, this has to be qualified in the sense that there is a décalage, Rama? Décalage dans le temps. How would you say that? Well,
There's a time lag.
Okay, yeah. Between production and export. That is, between the moment that the order is received, the production is completed, and the figures are in. But in general, I would say that what happens, for example, during this quarter, positive, would counterbalance what has happened negative in the past quarter. So all in all, I think we should consider that figures can be considered as actual figures. So we have an 8% growth at end September. Then we have a third subsector that we call that light engineering. I prefer to call that others. And this others includes jewelry, for which we have had a fairly interesting growth over the past 2-3 years, and we have reached something like 2.4 billion rupees worth of exports of jewelry to Europe and to the United States of America. And this, of course, has to do with also processing of gold and diamonds and gems. We have some light engineering in that, and we also have a new sector which is extremely interesting, a new subsector rather, which is medical devices. Less known, but we have 5 very good companies, all of them originating from abroad, which are producing in Mauritius products which I would say one wouldn't imagine in Mauritius, because we tend to consider that our industrial sector is a fairly basic one. But we produce catheters, we produce some very sort of sensitive parts. I say parts deliberately, that we use in surgical operations for the human body. And it also happens that we produce some, again, very sensitive parts that we export to Boeing and to Airbus. So this is I would say, the higher end of the market. The financial sector, I'm afraid I don't have the figures, the exact figure, but I know that we have experienced a very good growth in 2012. In tourism, which is also an important sector for us, about 8% of our GDP. In tourism, we have not seen any particular growth, but I think that being given the situation in Europe, which is our basic market. Left? Dear. Okay, I'll hurry up. Red flag. There is a marginal drop in the number of tourist arrivals, but there is again a marginal growth in tourism receipt. Our major problems in that particular respect, which account for what happens in our export trade. Number one, we have a fairly narrow base of our industrial sector, which needs absolutely to be broadened. Secondly, we also have a narrow base of our market configuration. We have been, of course, I mean, it's paid its dividends. We have been very much Eurocentric over the past 40 years. And again, this is something which needs to be addressed. And of course, we have, and this is intrinsic, this is structural, we have some major constraints on our marketing means. I think, Rama, I will stop here. I mean, this was just a constat. I suppose we can go further later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. The second panelist, Professor Maurice, will take us through the impact of the crisis on macroeconomic indicators. Maybe 2 observations. The first observation is that there is no one size that fits all. The impact will be country-specific. If you are a large, open economy and financially well-integrated than South Africa, probably the impact is going to be more. on your macroeconomic indicators than if you were a country like Ivory Coast. So I think to a large extent it will depend on each specific country. And the second one, based on what Minister Said Hussein has said, that even in a given country, the impact varies from sector to sector. In the case of Mauritius, tourism has been affected, textile has been affected, but financial services less so. And even within one particular sector, which is manufacturing, you see that some sectors are probably more vulnerable to the external shock. Fish exports have done relatively well, notwithstanding what is happening in the global economy. Up to you, Professor Morrison.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk about numbers or figures. I'll just cover the context of three macroeconomic effects. The first is effects on trade, and in particular exports. The second, which is related, is the issue of the financialization of commodities and how commodities were very much part of the financial trades that led to the crisis. And finally, the issue of access to capital, or really access to money, which was affected. I think the main point for sub-Saharan Africa in general is that there were impacts, but they were relatively short-lived in terms of the severe impacts. So, everything deteriorated rapidly in the latter half of 2008, and you can see effects at the macroeconomic level in 2009, but you see recovery after that. In the context of trade, the main reason for that is that most of the commodities that African countries export, minerals or soft commodities, have recovered and held up reasonably well. But that's not a reason for complacency, because of course there's no guarantee that that will continue to be the case. It's quite likely that Chinese demand will decline in the next few years, and that will affect some countries. The prices of tropical exports like coffee, tea, cocoa, they may well suffer and decline, and the prices of food are quite likely to increase, so there are challenges there. But the more relevant feature, I think, of the trade side is what I described as the financialization of commodities, which is the idea that, well, essentially it's a bit like saying that commodities are traded, whereas manufacturers are exported. And what I mean by that is that the value of manufacturing exports is a pretty good indication of the value to the economy of that activity, of the export activity. Whereas the value of commodity exports is much less evidently a measure of the benefit to the economy. First of all, because one does not really know what proportion of that price actually stays in the country. And one suspects that actually it's a very small proportion. And that's linked to the fact that commodities are traded. They're traded on global markets mostly by companies that have a very high degree of monopoly power. Glencore is now the most famous example of that, but there are many others in other commodities. And the world price of a commodity is a very poor indicator of what producers of that product are benefiting from. So a fundamental problem that Africa still has and needs to address is, and this has been a problem for 30, 40 years, is diversifying its production more and reducing its dependence on commodity exports, or if it is exporting commodities, trying to ensure that more of the resource rents and the price remains in the countries. And that's not a challenge that has arisen as a result of the financial crisis. It's always been there, but it's been attenuated by the crisis, because many commodities, because they're now traded internationally, they were rolled into the financial instruments that were ultimately the source of the whole problem. So the financial crisis affected commodity prices at the global level. And that means that there are things happening to the market in which the producers operate that the producers have absolutely no influence over whatsoever. And that's why you want to reduce dependence on commodities. The final issue that I'll talk about is the one about access to money. And to a large extent, that hasn't been, in macroeconomic terms, that hasn't been a great cost or impact. And one of the reasons is because most African countries, since the 1990s, have implemented, progressive, but not necessarily dramatic, economic policy reforms, in particular exchange rate and monetary management, so that for most of the countries, macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic management has improved.